The headset of your bike. What is it? Well, it's the assembly that holds the forks in place inside of the head tube. It also doubles up to give you super smooth steering. However, it is open to all sorts of impact and abuse whilst you're riding along, because every single bump you hit in the road, well, you're going to feel that through the handlebars. And in turn, you're also going to get quite a bit of water flicking up off the road, and that can sometimes affect the bearings. So today, we're going to look at how to adjust your headset if it's a little bit loose or a little bit tight. Let's look then at how the A headset works, or at least that's what we used to call these styles of headset back in the early 90s when they first launched. These days, it's just called a headset. Two separate words rather than one. Anyway, all of that trivia aside, how does it work? Well, on top of the fork itself, you have got the crown. So the crown is this area of the fork in particular, and then the steerer comes out of that. Slid down onto the steerer, you have got a crown race. That crown race, you then slide a bearing on top of that is specially machined, which then fits inside of the specially machined head tube. Yep, there's a lot of specially machined parts inside of the headset. The upper bearing, well, it's pretty similar, in fact, to the lower bearing. A difference can sometimes be in the actual diameter of it, because a lower bearing does take more impact and you want to spread that load a little bit more evenly or distribute it over a wider space. However, that upper bearing is kind of inversed as opposed to the lower bearing. So when I say that, I mean actually the way in which it's placed inside of the frame. Again, it's inside of a specially machined head tube. Then you would put a centering sleeve over the steerer of your fork, which helps keep that bearing really, really central. Then you put on the headset top cap cover, maybe a spacer, your stem, the headset top cap, and then the preload bolt. And then together, it all compresses into place and gives you that super smooth, judder-free riding. Now, one of the most common mistakes I see out there when someone has a loose headset is to grab themselves a Torx key or an Allen key and simply try and adjust that preload bolt and hope that does the job. It's not going to do it though. Why? Well, the stem bolts are tight, so therefore that preload bolt isn't going to do the job of compressing because, well, the stem's not going to be able to move at all. So how are we going to do that? First off, loosen that preload bolt and then loosen your stem bolts. In turn, that is then going to give you a little bit of room to adjust the compression levels. You want the stem bolts to be loose enough so that you can actually rotate the stem on the steerer, because this means that when you gently tighten down that preload bolt so that you just meet a little bit of resistance, you know that it's doing its job of compressing everything into place. Once you've met that resistance, realign your stem, tighten up those stem bolts, take the bike and just try and rock it backwards and forwards whilst locking up the front brake. If there is any juddering at all or any movement, then again, undo those stem bolts and just further tighten down that preload bolt slightly, maybe 1/8 of a turn, 1/4 of a turn, and retighten those bolts. If it is still rocking after quite a bit of adjustment to that preload bolt, actually take a look. So you could take off the top cap and then see if anything's falling foul there at all, because sometimes, particularly people who like to slam their stems, the underside of the top cap can have a little lip on it. And in turn, that little lip can be touching the fork steerer. So essentially, you're not going to get maximum compression, or in fact, enough compression that you need. If you have that, you could look for a top cap which doesn't have such a lip underneath, or alternatively, put a very thin spacer on top of the stem. So something like a 2, a 3, or a 5mm spacer, put that on top and try again. And I reckon you'll have solved that juddery movement. Now, on the flip side of that, if you've got yourself a tight headset, then you're going to want to do the reverse. So in effect, loosen off that preload bolt, undo the stem bolts, and then do that previous method I just showed you to actually tighten up the headset. How do you know though if you've got a tight headset? Well, best way is to have the bike off the ground, or certainly lift up the front wheel and try and turn those bars. If it's really stiff, or certainly stiffer than a free movement, ideally, if you're holding the bike up, the bars should find their way into their natural position, like so. If it's too stiff, well, it's not going to do that. Make sure, however, that it's not your cables that are causing any resistance for your bars to not turn naturally, because sometimes people have fallen victim to that in the past, thinking they've got a stiff headset, when in fact it was just the cables that was keeping the bars in place. So just bear that one in mind. When you are happy and content with your headset being absolutely perfect, then make sure you do up those stem bolts to the manufacturer's recommended torque setting, because after all, the steering is, I'm sure you'll agree, a very important part of your bike, and you don't want it to come loose and you don't want it to be too tight, because those carbon fibre steerers can be quite fragile sometimes, and you don't want to go crushing one of those when you're using these sorts of guns. Joking aside though, make sure you do them up to the correct torque setting. Finally then, sometimes you can't get those bearings back to their original silky smoothness. Why is that though? Well, because maybe you've been riding along with them loose for too long, or alternatively, tight for too long, and in turn the bearings and the races inside of them, they're just wearing away on one another, and despite all of your best efforts, it just won't work. If that is the case, then simply take them out and pop in some new ones. Now that is sometimes an absolute minefield, so my recommendation would be to pop along to your local bike shop if you're unaware of which ones you need, and they can point you in the right direction. Right, I hope you've enjoyed that, and now you've got yourself riding silky smooth through all those turns and corners that you're going to encounter whilst out riding. Remember as well to like this video, give it a share, give it a thumbs up, tell everyone about it, especially if you ride with someone who's got a juddery little action there on their headset. Also, don't forget to check out the GCN shop at shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com. We have a whole heap of goodies for you to spend your hard-earned pocket money on after all. And now for another great video. This one, how do the pros choose their stem length? Click on the stem.